Awesome. Well, thank you, Bruce, for joining us. For those at home, Bruce Lawson is here to talk to us a little bit about the OWA. But before we get to that, Bruce, I just wanted to have you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your sort of history on the web, and then we'll get into the OWA stuff, which is primarily what we want to talk about today.
For sure, yeah. Hi, Jason. Thanks for inviting me, by the way. It's great to be here. As you can possibly tell, I'm an Englishman, so I'm talking to you from a wintry evening here in Birmingham in the United Kingdom, not Alabama. I've been on the web now for a couple of decades. I discovered the web when I was living overseas. I was a head of primary at a school in Bangkok, Thailand, and I got diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and there was not much English language information available, but there was an internet cafe underneath my apartment in Bangkok, and I went in and typed in MS into Alta Vista, which is like Google but black and white and powered by Steam. And I found a community of people who'd been newly diagnosed all across the world on something called PHP-BB, a good old-fashioned bulletin board. But it
Yes.
blew my mind because here's a way of people across the world who don't know each other on different kinds of devices, chatting about a common purpose and supporting each other. And as an English literature and drama major, this seemed to me like the successor to Mr. Gutenberg's printing press, if you like. Something interesting happening. So I got into the web, got into web accessibility, and started blogging quite early on, 2004, and talking about that, and never looked back. So I've been variously a consultant, a developer relations person, and now I wrangle code for a children's charity in the UK. But I'm here after work under my under nobody's banner but my own, and my kind of weird, loose collective called Open Web Advocacy that have been trying to make Apple behave themselves about progressive web apps.
Excellent. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about that? Like, how did the OWA come about? How did you get involved with it? What is it trying to accomplish?
Well, it came about. It's prehistory. It wasn't the OWA. There was when I worked for Opera, the Norwegian web browser, as was. We quite early on implemented PWAs, web apps, if you like, which you could add to home screen on an Android device. And that was the time when lots and lots of APIs were becoming available to the browser. Because previously there'd been a thing called W3C widgets, which allowed you to make Chromeless, as in no browser Chrome, rather than the browser Chrome. You could make desktop apps with web technologies, which was great, but they couldn't do much because they couldn't actually integrate with anything in the system. It was only 2011, I think, before we even had geolocation, which was on every
Right.
phone, but no browser could integrate with it. And then we've variously got the ability to show video in HTML, the ability to capture video, capture imagery, and integrate with the device. But anyway, as the web became more powerful, the case for making apps with web technology became more realizable, and so a group of people at Mozilla, Google, Opera, people like yourself pioneered, evangelized them early on, and they became available on Android and Windows, etc. But they were never really available on iOS. Apple didn't really give them first class citizenship of iOS. Adding things to the home screen was hidden in a share menu. There wasn't a way for a website to say, you can add me to home screen, or there wasn't a way for the browser to tell you that this website could be added to a home screen. For a long while, there were no push notifications available to web browsers. They were always available in single platform apps, native apps, if you will,
Right.
that you had to get through the App Store and relied upon Apple's gatekeeping and potentially Apple taking a percentage. Excuse me. So, at random, some people contacted me on Twitter, RIP, and they said the UK monopoly regulator, which is called the Competition and Markets Authority, is opening an investigation into the mobile ecosystem. Is it open? Is it competitive enough, or is it dominated too much by Google and Apple primarily? Would I be interested in going to speak to the UK government because they had a public consultation? These chaps are in Australia, but they are British citizens. But obviously, flying from Australia to the UK is a bit further than getting on a train for 2 hours to London, which it is for me. And I thought, yeah, I haven't caused any trouble for a long time. It's about time I caused some trouble. So I asked my friend and another Birmingham resident called Stuart Langridge, who's an old friend of mine, because he's really good at explaining complicated things in a way that economists and lawyers, because those are the people who are on regulators, he's really good at explaining things to those people in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're being patronised or talked down to. So it was the four of us, and we went to the CMA in the UK, and we said, it's very cheeky of us. We said, look, basically, you're asking the wrong questions. You're looking at it as Google versus Apple, but there is a third way. There is the web and progressive web apps, which are, as you know, but maybe not every one of your listeners does, which are basically a website plus plus. So in an old browser or a low-powered device, they're just a website. But in a higher spec device or a more modern device, they can be added to the home screen with an icon, tickled into life with your digit, just like a regular single platform app. And to all intents and purposes, because they're full screen and they have access to device APIs, they can function perfectly well as an app. So the CMA, I think, were kind of weirded out at a group of ramshackle web developers of turning up to meetings and woefully. We weren't in suits and we didn't have shiny PowerPoint, but we had compelling arguments.
Right.
So they listened to us, and regulators talk to each other just like web developers do. And they said to the EU, who were running a similar investigation but were much, much further down the line, you might want to talk to these folks. By this point, we'd expanded from the four of us to a very loose collective, probably a dozen people in Australia, California, UK, the Netherlands, Estonia, Germany, but just developers. We were just organising this through Signal, and whoever of us were free on a certain day would turn up on the meetings, because they were all on Zoom through the pandemic or Teams or WebEx or something. The DMA, with the Digital Markets Act, which is the EU-wide legislation, the first draft of it didn't include anything about PWAs. It talked about browsers, and I don't think it had crossed the regulator's consciousness that although there are alternate browsers on iOS called Chrome and Edge and Firefox, they are not really alternates because they're all obliged by Apple's rules to use the same engine that powers Safari, which is called WebKit. And importantly, it's not any kind of WebKit. You can't ship your own WebKit. You have to use the thing that Apple provides. So the browsers might have a different UI. They might have a different name, but they're effectively white labeled Safari. And Apple were not implementing the device APIs that we needed in order to make PWAs a compelling or a realistic competitor. Obviously, you can't say to Apple, you must implement these APIs in Safari because it's their browser, it's their decision to make. So the DMA said, well, we can't compel Apple to implement APIs it doesn't want to, but we can compel them to allow real browser choice, as in not just a skinned version of WebKit called Chrome, but Chrome with its own engine called Blink, or Firefox with its own engine called Gecko. And those do implement the APIs we need. And so whereas I've always talked about browser sniffing and how evil it is on the open web, we could in theory say, dear user, I see you've opened this PWA in Safari, but if you really want to be able to receive push notifications, or if you really want to be able to use web Bluetooth, please install it with Firefox or Chrome and give the users a choice. So that got passed into law. There was a long lead in. All the big technology companies were told that you were under the aegis of the Digital Markets Act if you were going to be named as a gatekeeper in the EU. So this isn't just Apple. Microsoft is a gatekeeper. Google is a gatekeeper. Meta is a gatekeeper because of Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook. Whoever it is who owns TikTok is a gatekeeper. ByteDance, is it? I can't remember the name, but anyway.
Yeah.
So this isn't Apple fighting. This isn't the EU having a go at Apple. This is the EU regulating the colossal tech companies to ensure that smaller companies can enter the market, to ensure that the huge behemoths are not abusing their market position, etc. In next month, early March, the DMA will be enforced. It's already law, but the regulators acknowledge that operating systems and browsers are not trivial apps, and it takes time to make changes. And we could see that Apple had released its statement of compliance saying it would allow third-party browsers, but then managed to produce some rules that are so onerous that Firefox, for example, have said, this is next to impossible because they're going to have to maintain two separate code bases, whereas Apple don't.
So I'm sorry.
Sorry, go for it, Jason. I've been monologuing.
I want to come back to the Firefox thing in a second, but I want to go back to something you talked about, the EU not knowing about PWAs, sort of when they were starting this stuff. Does the DMA actually refer to PWAs specifically, or does it just talk about browser choice?
It talked about browsers after we briefed them, and other people have briefed them, because it's an open process. There was wording went in to talk about browser engines, because a lot of web developers didn't know that Chrome on iOS was not the same as Chrome anywhere else.
It still comes up with. I think last week I sent an email basically to that effect to a developer at a client organization who. But we were talking about a capability that wasn't available in Safari. And they were saying, well, at least they'll be able to use Chrome on iOS. And I was like, well, actually they won't, because you are in the US, and in the US, Chrome is really WebKit. Okay, so going back to Firefox for a second, so Firefox has decided, what are the onerous things that I thought, and I missed this part, so I'm really surprised. This is news to me. So Firefox has decided that they're not going to participate in the EU with the browser choice even as it's,
They haven't said that to my knowledge,
okay.
Jason. Although the situation is moving so fast and so fluidly, I've been knee deep in code all afternoon. For all I know, the situation's
Yeah,
changed, but they haven't
exactly.
said it. But Apple have rather reluctantly released an SDK upon which third-party browser engines can code. They're charging a core technology fee for using this SDK. There's all kinds of
So, okay,
weird restrictions.
so browsers actually have to, like, I'd mistakenly thought that there was like these two tracks where it was the native app and the marketplace stores and things of that nature, and the core technology fee applied to that, and then there was like third-party browser support. But you're saying that even third-party browsers have to pay the core technology fee for
I believe so, but I would
oh
have to
geez.
check. And the reason for that is the most pressing or business of the day has been progressive web apps,
Mm-hmm.
because Apple have said they're going to be killed. And whereas I care very much about Firefox and Chrome being allowed on iOS, that's not a fight that I have any influence in.
Right.
You know, that is Google versus Apple, that is Mozilla versus Apple. But
Right.
progressive web apps being killed is small developers like me
Right.
being
Exactly. Yeah.
stamped on by Apple.
Okay.
And of course, I mean, as you know, everybody in Europe is basically a Marxist, but there is power in collective action.
Right. Right.
So Apple said in a beta, PWA stopped working. They hadn't said anything in their statement of compliance, which they published to the EU and published openly, but people noticed that PWA stopped working. And in beta 2 and beta 3, PWA still were not working. People were submitting bug reports. And we, OWA, by which this point we'd actually become an organization with, what you call it, a constitution and
Mm-hmm.
a president or a el president. I don't even know what the title is. We're still a loose collection of developers. We'd made a noise, talked to the press, and Apple sneaked out a statement behind a closed accordion somewhere on a page saying, "Oh yeah, we've taken away PWAs because it's too hard for us to implement the ability for third-party browsers to talk to the operating system. So we're just taking away PWAs out of the world." I assume, and I'm not a lawyer, I've done many terrible things in my life, but at least I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but I assume it's because the DMA will be enforced from March the 7th.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not allowed to materially worsen a service that's offered to consumers or business users in order to stymie competition. So my guess is they're thinking, well, if they take away the ability for iOS, WebKit on iOS to do PWAs in a meaningful way, then they can say, well, it's not part of the platform anymore, and therefore we're not denying our competitors the ability to use it because we've got rid of it. So if you have a PWA, it will open, but in a browser tab. It won't be full screen anymore.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that PWAs, because the user installs them, they get more persistent storage. Safari, if you don't open a browser tab for 7 days, the storage will be erased. We don't think, although it's opaque, Apple haven't said, we don't think they will have access to push notifications anymore. We don't think they will have access to ambient badging, whereby the icon on your home screen might have a little red circle to tell you you've got a new message, for example. And if you think about it, these are absolutely core features. There are loads and loads of small businesses and medium-sized businesses, but not at the Google, Firefox, Apple level of business, who make web apps because they don't want to be in the App Store, or they can't be in the App Store, or they don't want to pay 30% to Apple, who've been making PWAs, whose businesses could very well just be pulled from underneath them. Recently, we briefed the EU, and it's no secret that we brief the EU like every other interested party briefs the EU. And there was a fella there from Estonia, and he has a PWA used by lots and lots of people, but it's used by a lot of journalists. And he was saying that he's been talking to some of his journalists who are using it. They're on the front lines in Ukraine.
Oh, geez.
So they write their stories into this PWA. They don't necessarily know when they're going to get back and be able to connect again.
Right.
If Safari just wipes it, they lose
all their
stuff.
stories.
There are people, there's another one which is an oncology app, and it's for people to manage their note and stuff, their cancer treatments and symptoms. Sensitive data like that is best stored on your local device rather than uploaded to a cloud, or where you've got to worry about whatever the local equivalent of HIPAA is, for example. Also, many people don't want to be uploading that information to a cloud provider. They want it on their device. We talked to somebody else who makes a nice living selling apps that for sports teams. And effectively, he's got, a code base, and he might badge it and brand it for Real Madrid, or I assume a lot of your users are American, so I'm going to use an American football analogy for the South Dakota Termites, or whatever they're called. I don't know. I don't watch
Portland Thorns.
American football.
That is
Okay,
also.
thank you.
That is also that is a women's soccer team, as we would call it here. Yeah.
Huzzah!
Yeah.
But what Apple calls cookie cutter apps are not allowed on the App Store. So whereas Apple say, if use a web app, if you can't be on the App Store, you won't be able to use a web app anymore, and they put rules on what could be in the App Store. I don't disagree with they have a right to put rules on what's on the App Store. If Apple don't want to host, adult content, and by which I don't necessarily mean porn, it could be gay dating apps or some kind of fetish apps which you might not like or somebody else might not like, but it's a world out there and people have a right to them. But if Apple don't want to host those things, do not pull the rug from the open web technology that allows those things to exist. There are use cases across the world. I'd never thought about journalists on the Ukrainian front lines not being able to connect or not wanting to connect, because there's a whole world out there that's completely alien from my experience. And this is why the web is the platform. The web was invented to host physics papers.
Right.
Look at what's on there now, stuff that Sir Uncle Timbo could never have guessed at. But because it's open and anybody can publish stuff, the stuff exists. And I think, generally we're all better off for it. If you take away the ability for web apps actually to do app-like things rather than just be, a browser tab with Wikipedia on it, and you say the only way for anything app-like is to be in the App Store, which, here are our rules, and by the way, pay us 30%. It is, I believe, it's crippling the open web. And I'm a man with a disability. I don't use the phrase crippling lightly, but it really is, I think, an absolute sucker punch to the web. The reason, I think, Apple have said they'll allow alternate app stores. Apple have said they'll allow third-party browsers with relatively onerous conditions, but they will allow them. But PWAs is the one thing they're not willing to share. They would rather destroy them than share them, because they know that it is a huge competitor to the App Store.
So let's
And
talk
that's big
just
money.
a little bit. So the particulars, as I understand it, the what Apple is taking away is the ability to, you can still add something to your home screen, but it no longer ends up being sort of like a different version. I'm not even sure what they called it, but there was a version before where you'd add something to the home screen and it just basically acted like a bookmark in a previous version of iOS. And then at some point in iOS, they added the ability where if you added it to the home screen, then it acted more app-like. It take up the full screen, and it gained additional privileges. The privileges included the persistent storage that you talked about and push notifications, and maybe others that I'm not thinking of. Those are the two that people have been sort of focused on. And now what they're saying is that they're essentially going back to the previous way, which is basically it's just a bookmark icon on your home screen that launches up your browser. And they're saying their argument that they published is that they're doing this because the DMA is forcing them to do it because they can have differences between what they offer on their platform in Safari and what other browsers can offer, and they don't have the time or resources or whatever to make it so that other browsers could do that exact same add to home screen experience without it, without security concerns. I believe that that's the state of things, right? In their summary, whether or not we believe their summary or not, but that's kind of the state of things, right? Did I get anything wrong in that?
Some of what you've said there is more a synopsis of what we surmise than what was said, because very little has been said. So we've been told, for example, that after the DMA comes into force next month, if you open a PWA, it will be a tab in your browser. They haven't said goodbye push notifications, etc. But they haven't said. So we are surmising. Bear in mind that I'm in the UK, and tragically, in my opinion, it's a bad thing, but the UK is no longer in the EU. Right. So I can't test it because I'm not in the EU. And you, as an American, you can't test it if you have EU customers. If you're in the EU, you cannot test how it will behave for your American customers or your Canadian customers, your Mexican customers, your Brazilian customers, or your Trinidadian customers, because it's going to be geo-locked. We don't know how. We don't know how that will operate. People have been trying to reverse engineer it to in the EU. I'm not clever enough to do that. And there's all kind of weird edge cases. There are plenty of people who live in Norway but work in Sweden, for example. So they might be in the EU when they're at home and they're not in the EU when they're at work, or vice versa. What's going to happen? Are they going to have to download a new version of iOS every time they cross the border? How will Apple know? Because apparently you can only change your recorded location on the App Store every 90 days. What would happen if your PWA for recording your insulin levels times out in 7 days, but then you go over the border and you're outside the EU? None of this is made plain. We simply don't know. So We surmise the worst. I don't think that's us being uncharitable. They could have mentioned this in their compliance statement to the EU. They could have mentioned this in beta 1, beta 2, etc. But it was just nothing said, no reply on bug reports. So I personally, Bruce Lawson and nobody else, think they were trying to sneak this out under the radar. But I don't know. They don't write and tell me.
So I saw an article in the Verge, I think actually today.
Yeah.
Today's February 26th, that EU regulators are starting to look at Apple's browser compliance and what they're doing on PWAs. Is that sort of what happens next? Like, do you have a sense of what happens next? If Apple's doing malicious compliance, like, or is this all unprecedented? So we don't really know what how the EU will respond, or
I honestly don't know. It is unprecedented. When Apple's announcement when they sneaked out the minimum amount of information they could, we organised a survey because they said something like, "Yeah, sorry about PWAs, guys, but nobody uses them." It's like, well, if they are not particularly used, that might be because Apple haven't exactly made them particularly usable. But let's actually test this. So we opened a survey. It's still open, and we asked developers, how will this affect you? We got a great many replies, which we bagged up in a great big document with permission from the people who submitted the information and gave it to the EU because, the EU, I keep saying to people, I have a view of the world and how it should be. But I appreciate that not everybody shares that perspective, and it's not, much as I'd like it to be, the EU doesn't necessarily look and think, well, what would Bruce like? So we have to go to them with data.
right.
So
exactly.
we asked developers for data. How many users do you have? If you don't mind telling us, what kind of money does that involve? How many people does your business, how many people does this employ? And please give us a sense of the kind of PWA it is. And this is how I found out about the journalism one with people on the Ukrainian front lines. Because there's a massive world out there of people doing fascinating things that I would never have thought of because I don't live in those places, etc. And we took many, many, many replies, and we just gave it to the EU and said, here is some data from developers in the EU, the people that this act is designed to protect, because it's not just to protect consumer choice, it's designed to protect developers and businesses inside the EU, because one of the reasons they were even investigating the mobile ecosystem is that now this stuff is infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and developers are, powerhouses of economic innovation and wealth generation. We took the stuff to the EU. They read it, presumably, because a few of the people said, hey, I've had an email back from, the EU asking for more info. And then that piece in The Verge came out this afternoon in my time. And the EU had said, we're asking, I think they said something like, I paraphrase, but something like, we confirm that we've written to Apple and to developers for more information. And regardless of where you sit on the political divide, etc., I think it's absolutely right that they write to Apple, and it's absolutely right they talk to developers inside the EU and outside and gather information rather than making their decision on which way the political wind is blowing, or personal animosity, or the vagaries of fashion. Get the data and then make the decision.
It's
And of course, it's not just EU developers. American developers sell to the
right,
EU developers sell to the States.
right. Well, and I was going to say, because this is like we've talked a bit about this, about the challenges of people who might live in one country, go to another. One of the things that I wrote about was the challenge for us of testing anything that like we have no access to. If Chrome decides to pay the core technology fee, and or Google, I guess, decides to pay it, and Chrome is now available, real Chrome is available in Europe, I have no way to access it. If somebody reports a bug, I have no way to test it. Like, I basically have no sense of what will happen when that is the case. But what I just realized in this is that when we were talking about it, about the example of journalists in Ukraine, presumably those are EU journalists going into a non-EU country, right, and doing their work, and in dangerous conditions. And this is actually like an unforeseen consequence of the idea that you're going to have different rules in different browsers based on where somebody's iTunes App Store, or App Store, I guess as they call it now, right,
Mm-hmm.
is registered. Because now all of a sudden, because they happen to be journalists who are, I mean, will they even know? Um, will those? I mean, this is like there are people, presumably people on the front lines in Ukraine, who could find themselves in what they think is a safe place, go to bed at night, their iOS version does its update because now they're off the front line, they're in a hotel or whatever, they plug it in, their phone doesn't update, they don't think anything of it, they get in their vehicle, they go back to the front line to report, and all of a sudden they're using the app. It behaves differently. It tells them, maybe it does I've seen the screenshots of this app will no longer open in the home screen, it's going to open in your browser. But in that instance, unless the developers, I guess the onus is on the developers then to tell them that their stuff's only going to get saved for 7 days, somehow let them know, because otherwise, from Apple's perspective, that's just a done deal. Your data's gone in 7 days, and good luck to you all. That's just a, I don't know. I guess in that situation, they're losing stories, so their lives aren't threatened in that. But it does feel tremendously precarious for them in that
It
situation.
does.
Yeah,
It does. Let's unpick what you said. I mean, excuse me, it'll come to no surprise to you that I agree with you. One of the worrying things, I mean, the most worrying thing for a Ukrainian journalist isn't, he's far more life and limb and pressing. But
right,
one of the
exactly.
worrying things, of course, is that nobody knows. Apple presumably knows, but they haven't told anybody.
Right,
And I'm not, as you can see, dear viewers, is I am not a shiny suited businessman with who thinks about such things, but I'm told by people who are that the thing that businesses hate most is uncertainty. If I were a business person, I would be taking home from this: if you want reliable distribution that your users can trust on iOS, the App Store is the only game in town. I don't think, maybe that's not what Apple were hoping to achieve, but I don't think sending that message is something that they
but it's consistent
actively
with the way
hate
that they
sending
treated. I
out.
mean, we haven't even really talked about the native side, which, like you, I'm less interested in. But it does seem like their entire perspective on the native side is to discourage other app stores, to make it so onerous that nobody will actually try to use the rules created by the DMA to create alternative mechanisms for app installation.
It,
Um,
it would seem that way. But another thing you said, Jason, is the, unintended consequences. I've seen a few people on Twitter or less informed press reports saying it's an unintended consequence of the DMA. It isn't. It isn't. Apple have said that they're required to do this by the DMA. They're not. They could open up iOS to other browser engines, allow PWAs. They don't need to geofence it. They could do it worldwide, because here at OWA we've also briefed the UK regulators. As I mentioned to you, we've briefed the Australian regulators, and they finished writing their report and they're legislating. We've briefed the Japanese regulators. There are other regulators. This is coming. Apple could do the right thing and compete on its great strengths. It has a great track record of UI design. It's got a great track record of protecting user privacy, etc. Apple could say, okay, there's other browser engines. If you value, lovely looking design, really long battery life, privacy and security, use Safari. And people would.
yeah.
Not everybody would, but a lot of people do. On the Mac, where you've been allowed to install other browsers since time immemorial, the majority of people are still predominantly, they test other browsers if they're us, but they're predominantly Safari users. There's a reason for that. They've chosen it
Right.
because it's good. Apple could do this. My hope, my personal Bruce Lawson, not representing anybody else, my hope is that this is an unintended consequence of Apple's own panic, if you like, and they haven't thought through the effects that it's going to have on developers in the EU and worldwide, and journalists in dangerous conditions, and the cancer patients who are using that app, and there's a PWA somewhere that deals with kindergarten and sends push notifications to people, etc., that they won't be able to receive anymore. They haven't thought about these people. And, the EU, it's not in the business of chasing down and punishing companies. What it wants to do is to ensure free and fair competition. I can't speak for the DMA, but I know how regulators work. They don't want a fight. They don't
Right.
want litigation. They want the open competition.
Right.
I'm sure if Apple went and said, we hadn't realised this, we don't think we can get it done by March 7th, can we have a grace period? I'm sure I if the EU came and said to me, Bruce, shall we give them an extra 3 months? I'd say, yeah. If they're going to do the right thing, yeah. Tell everybody you're going to do the right thing, so businesses can sit back and not worry, and the developers can carry on developing rather than desperately trying to make a native app, or desperately trying to bag this thing up in some wrapper to get it into the App Store, or panic that their business is going to fail because they have some kind of app that Apple doesn't want. Who wouldn't say, have a bit more time if you're going to do the right thing? But again, I'm not Captain EU. This is what would I do?
Right.
Because
right.
they want the open and free and fair competition. That's the end result. That's the goal, not big fisticuffs and press.
So you mentioned, I was going to ask about what's happening in other locales. So the UK CMA, is, you said Australia, Japan, like how far along are those? Like, are we, do you think we're going to see action? And are there others? Like, and I'm assuming that the US is not even on the on the radar yet in this regard. But I'm just kind of curious what's happening in other places.
I haven't heard of anything in the US. Australia, they did a report. They're writing legislation, but they've got stuff about browser engines and web apps. The UK, it was slightly muddied by the fact that the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, needed an act of parliament passed to establish a team that could do the work of policing, for want of a better word, digital markets. The act of parliament hasn't happened yet, and I don't know when it will, because we're coming up to an election. Apple tried to throw a spanner in the works by arguing that the CMA had not allowed enough time, or had one day over a time limit, and therefore should be not allowed to do anything. It's one of those things where if you can't beat the result, try and beat them on the technicalities of the process. That was overruled. Apple were given X days to appeal. They didn't appeal, so the process continues. But it does need an act of parliament. It's not no political organisation in the UK, no party in the UK is against this. They all want it to happen. It's just a matter of legislative time, really. From memory, the Japanese regulator has produced its report, and it's gone to whatever the next stage in the Japanese legislative process is. Most of these organisations, they produce a report with recommendations, and then it goes up the chain, and maybe it's act of parliament required, or maybe it's what do you call it, executive order. But everybody's come out favourably for us so far. If I were cynical, I would think, Apple really wants to play hardball in the EU because it's 500 million people, to discourage other regulators. If the EU can't actually do the regulating, right, is the Australian government going to be able to? Because simply Australia is a lot smaller than the EU. But it's $1 trillion company. It's not a human being with emotions, and it's neither evil nor does it have a better side to which one can appeal. It is a huge behemoth of an organisation. There's the corporation, I think, is everybody worries about AI. A gigantic, intelligent beast with no morals or emotions that will take over the world and enslave us all. That's the corporation. That happened 100 years ago, man. That ship has sailed. And I don't, I'm not picking on Apple. This is what corporations are. I'm talking to you from a Mac that I bought with my own money. I record my music on a Mac.
Yeah.
Mrs. Lawson has an iPhone. I'm not antipathetic to Apple as an organization, but I love the web more than I love any corporation.
Absolutely.
That's what I want. Yeah. And people say, "Oh, Bruce, you want Chromium to take over the world." Man, I don't. I work for Opera, which had its own browser engine called Presto.
Right.
My day-to-day browser is Firefox. To stop Chromium taking over the world, we need a strong competitor. There is nothing to stop Safari being on Windows. It was briefly. There's nothing to stop Safari being on Linux or Android. WebKit works there.
Right.
Apple could have a fantastic cross-browser, a cross-operating system, cross-device browser in Safari. Because if anybody can give Chrome a run for its money, Apple can. It's got the budget, it's got developer love, it's got consumer brand recognition, it's got brand loyalty.
Right.
They could choose to do.
It's got
They could
they've got a
choose
good
to turn this to
browser
the
team
advantage.
and a good engine. Like they've
They,
been improving Safari quite a bit over the last few years. It's a shame. I mean, the decisions, I assume, being made above the pay grade of the people working on WebKit and working on Safari are undermining the good work that team has done, and the sort of the um, goodwill that they've garnered from web developers over the last couple of years.
100%, Jason. You know, I last year, maybe 2 years ago, on Losers Track, I was in London having a beer with an Apple CSS working group representative.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say I'm friends with, but I'm friendly with
Right.
some of the WebKit reps on the CSS working group. I've had many a beer with at least half a dozen people in the Safari team because they used to work in Opera or Firefox
Right.
or in the periphery of me. These people are doing great work, and I bear them no ill will. And I wouldn't want to guess how they feel today. Well, I can guess, but I wouldn't want to speculate publicly because people change. I doubt they have because they're good people. But I would be willing to bet none of these decisions are made by people on the WebKit team.
Right.
I wouldn't
So
bet that much because I'm not rich, but I
so
spent all my money on Macs.
so we don't have a lot of time left, both for this conversation and also before the DMA deadline, right? Like
Just generally in life, man.
we are getting old. I noticed on the OWA's website, there's this big countdown timer, 9 days until the DMA deadline, which begs a few questions, right? First, if people who are listening are upset, will be impacted, things of that nature, what can they do? What do you recommend they do?
It is Monday 26th today, as
Yeah.
you said, when we're recording this. Hopefully, by the time this goes out, we will have published an open letter to Tim Cook in which EU businesses, EU citizens, and impacted other people, because web developers across the world sell to the EU and vice versa, will write to Tim Cook, the head honcho of Apple. The reason for doing this isn't just publicity. The DMA says that users, I paraphrase, but it's something like users who avail themselves of the rights afforded in paragraph 4 and 5, 7 and 8, I make the numbers up, shall not have their ability to exercise those rights to use PWAs and alternative browsers removed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's unclear to us what avail yourself of those rights means, but if we write before this stuff is removed from iOS and avail ourselves of those rights, there's a reasonable suggestion from people cleverer than me that would put Apple in contravention if they subsequently remove those features. Even though the DMA won't be being enforced until March, the DMA is the law now.
Right.
And if I want to avail myself of the right to use a PWA on iOS today, in the current iOS version and the current Safari version, I can. And if they remove it after I have availed myself of it, whatever that means,
Right.
are they in contravention? We don't know. But it's a something to do. And we hope that enough web developers and businesses will sign this just in case Apple didn't really understand the ramifications of their decisions to kill PWAs.
Right.
Because also, whereas I said, corporations are big, all-knowing, all-seeing entities that control our lives. Of course, they're not. Corporations are made by loads of people, and people make mistakes. And let's pretend or hope that maybe somebody has just made a mistake here, and let's go to them and say, look, you are going to impact potentially hundreds of thousands of consumers and developers, certainly millions of dollars or euros or pounds or krona or whatever the currency you want are on the line here. Hold up, don't take anything out. Let's have a conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what else we can do. I'm
and
a
there's
lover,
still
not
the
a fighter,
survey.
as
So
you
there's
know,
an
Jason.
open letter coming that people can sign, and there's the survey still open, and we'll link to both of those from wherever we're posting this video and in the podcast notes. Does the OWA are there ways people can get involved with the OWA?
Right now, the best thing you can do is support the efforts that we're doing this way. We've had a really, really, really heartwarming response by the people volunteering to help us, help sift through stuff, do web design work for us, etc. Because it's all volunteers.
Right.
We're all just developers. It's getting now when it's almost like it's hard. Even it needs project managers, and none of us are project managers. We are people who wrangle code. The best thing people can do is spread the word, sign the stuff, fill in the survey, write a blog post and tell us about it. That's a great one. Because again, it's data. If I can show a regulator that Jason Grigsby, who is a demonstrably real human being with a demonstrable business
I'm AI,
presence.
Actually. I'm sorry, I've been replaced.
Okay, yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
But if I can say, here is a guy, you can check out his bona fides. He's got a company, he's incorporated in Portland, and he's saying this about his business. That's a data point. It's not me just making it up, saying, this is actually really terrible to the open web. If developers say, this is going to impact us, this will impact our users, this will impact our business, this is how, that's great, because there's nothing like citable, identifiable data points to win the argument. In fact, I'd say it's the only way you can win an argument, really, or it's the only way you should be able to win an argument.
Right.
We want to counter Apple saying, yeah, but sorry about PWAs, but nobody really liked them anyway. We want to counter that by saying, we do.
Yeah.
So
it's particularly frustrating. So for so long, the challenge in getting businesses excited about using PWAs, even though they didn't push notifications weren't the be all end all for PWAs, but it was the barrier, right? Inevitably the organization would say, we need to do push notifications. We'd say, well, on iOS, you have to get in the App Store to do it. And that would kind of put a damper on the plans. And then a year ago, we finally get them on iOS, and now they're going away, or at least appear to be going away. That's I guess the other piece that developers should probably do, or any company that's selling has a web application that is serves multiple countries, is pay attention to what's happening, because we're speculating on portions of this, right? We don't actually know what will happen in 9 days, which may be the worst part of it all.
And it could very well be that stuff that your listeners are hearing now is actually superseded by events, because things are moving so fast,
right,
that maybe everything we've said is superseded. I'll tell you what, man, I ages ago, I submitted a talk to my local meetup. it's a talk I'd already got in the bag, talking about PWAs and how great they were, and finally we're winning. That talk's on Thursday, and I'm not going to be able to write it till Wednesday night because it's going to be out of date.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Well, is there anything
I'm not
else?
holding you personally responsible.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm sorry. You have to do that. I'm glad it's you and not me. Although I don't know that there's been a single time where I've given a talk where I haven't had to make I had to make is a strong word. Felt compelled to make, could not help myself to make last minute changes to that talk. Derek Fredlerstone and I once joked that if we could like create a service where you lock away people's slides, presenter slides, and then incrementally charge more money the closer it got to the event to allow the presenter to take the slides out to tweak them, and that you could. And it would both be the sort of thing that I would love to do to try to prevent me from that habit, and also something that would cost me so much money because I couldn't help myself but to pay to make like one last minute tweak. At least you've got an excuse. Like I oftentimes don't have an excuse for that. With PWA stuff moving so quickly, you actually have a reason to make last minute tweaks.
Well, let's hope that the information that the EU is seeking from developers and Apple give them enough ammunition to be able to go back to Apple and say, no, you can't do this. And Apple go, oh, okay, fair enough. You never know. I'm by nature an optimistic chap, so let's hope everybody just shakes hands and gives each other a hug.
Well, that I think is an awesome place to stop. Is there any that would be ideal? So let's wrap up. Where can people find you? Where can they follow the OWA and follow the stuff you're working on?
If you open-web-advocacy.org, and there's a link to all the gazillion different social media icons there. But there's a thing that says news, and that's quite topical. There's a Discord server. I'm not a Discord man myself. And we're on the usual social networks, except I don't think we're on Facebook. Sorry.
It's quite all right. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. This has been awesome.
Thank you for having me, Jason. I really do appreciate it. And thanks for giving me a soapbox to stand on. And thank you, listeners and viewers. Especially thank you, viewers, because you've had to look at my face.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much.